At the border between the US and Mexico, there's a sharpshooter. Alone, armed with nothing but an old rifle, he guards this dangerous stretch of borderland, a region long known as a hotspot for smuggling rings and gang activity. He's no elite special forces operator, nor is he a border patrol agent. He's just a 69-year-old rancher whose property happens to sit right on the border. On this particular day, Jim had his rifle trained on a gray wolf feeding in the distance, 800 meters out. One shot was all it took. Confident, he lowered his weapon. When Jim walked over to inspect, he found the wolf lying dead on the spot, its neck pierced clean through. But the sight brought him no relief. Beside the wolf lay one of his calves, torn apart by the pack, and his heart sank all over again. Over the years, paying for his wife's medical treatment had drained his savings. He'd sold off most of his land and livestock, and all that remained were a dozen scrawny cattle and a small patch of hillside. Sadly, his wife hadn't pulled through in the end. All that was left of her was a lonely grave on that hilltop. Middle-aged and left with nothing, that was Jim's life now. To make matters worse, the bank came knocking, demanding payment and warning him that if he couldn't come up with the money, they'd take even the plot of land where his wife was buried. Desperate to hold on to that last piece of her, Jim sold off his remaining cattle for cheap and swallowed his pride to ask a friend for work at his construction site. He didn't care how dirty or hard the job was. He'd take anything. But when his friend saw how old he was, he turned him down. While Jim was drowning in debt, he had a chance encounter near the border with a Mexican woman and her son who had just crossed over illegally. The woman's leg was injured and she couldn't go any further, so she begged Jim to help them get away, promising a generous payment in return. Jim was still weighing his options when a black car suddenly pulled up on the other side of the border fence. 3 Mexican gang members stepped out. They were there to bring the mother and son back. Faced with their threats, Jim refused to back down and wouldn't hand them over. After a brief standoff, the gang drew their guns, but Jim was faster. A fierce firefight broke out. Even with his sharp shooting skills, Jim struggled to gain the upper hand against their overwhelming firepower. Thinking fast, he told the mother and son to jump in the car, slammed on the gas, and tore out of there. To his shock, the gang's leader, John, came charging at him like a madman and threw himself onto the car, locking his hands around Jim's throat as if he was ready to die trying. Luckily, they were heading down a slope. Jim seized the moment and slammed on the brakes, and the sudden force flung John off the vehicle. He threw the car in reverse and made his escape with the mother and son. Meanwhile, John's men caught up with the news. The man Jim had shot dead was John's own brother. His wounds had been too severe to survive. When John heard this, he stared coldly in the direction Jim had fled. This feud was just getting started. The woman didn't make it out either. In the chaos, she'd taken a bullet to the stomach, and she was fading fast. Before she died, she entrusted her young son Miguel to Jim, asking him to get the boys safely to relatives in Chicago. At first, Jim wanted no part of any of this. He figured that if he just handed Miguel over to Border Patrol, he'd done everything he needed to do. But the next morning, he discovered the woman had left her bag in his car. When he opened it, he found stacks and stacks of cash. The whole bag was packed with it. In that moment, Jim finally understood why the gang was hunting this mother and son so relentlessly. He knew that as long as the gang didn't have their money back, Miguel would never be safe. Take the money and run, or go back for the boy.
God damn it.
After some inner struggle, Jim chose to turn around. He slipped into the Border Patrol station, and when no one was looking, snuck Miguel out through the back door. With his dog along for company, the car now carried just 2 people and 1 dog. Without wasting a moment, they hit the road for Chicago. Meanwhile, John had already tracked down Jim's home. Finding the place empty, he flew into a rage and set the house on fire. But even that didn't satisfy him. He swore he'd find Jim no matter what. By digging through Jim's spending records, John's crew quickly pinned down his location and started chasing him along the route. At the same time, Jim's car broke down, costing him half a day. Once the car was fixed and he got back on the road, he was pulled over by a police car. Without any explanation, the officer ordered him out of the vehicle and put him in the cruiser. Then the cop got on the phone while pocketing Jim's car keys. Something felt off. The officer's behavior didn't look like normal law enforcement. It looked more like he was stalling for time. Jim noticed how the man kept glancing toward the highway, as if waiting for someone to arrive. Then it hit him. This cop had been bought off by the gang and was setting him up. Realizing the game was up, the officer dropped the act. At that critical moment, the dog in the car suddenly lunged. Jim seized the opportunity and pinned down the hand holding the gun. With his dog's help, he wrestled the cop to the ground and knocked him out with 2 solid punches. Jim looked out at the highway and immediately knew something was wrong. He grabbed his keys, started the car, and swung down a hidden side road. Just then, the gang showed up. They surrounded the cop, and John started beating him savagely, demanding to know which way Jim had gone.
What is this? Where? I don't know!
Hidden in the distance, Jim watched it all unfold. When it became clear the cop had nothing more to give, John lost all patience. Killing a police officer in broad daylight, Jim finally realized just how far gone these people were. They had no limits. To stay alive, he had to keep running with Miguel. When night fell, the 2 took shelter at a remote roadside motel. He hoped they'd finally shaken their pursuers, but the gang caught up soon enough. They killed the motel owner and closed in on Jim's room, step by step. At the last second, Jim shook Miguel awake, and the two climbed out the back window and hid in the nearby bushes. Under the cover of darkness, they managed to avoid the gang's search. But just as the gang was about to leave, Jim's dog came bursting out. John didn't hesitate. He fired and dropped the dog on the spot. Jim saw the whole thing. But to protect Miguel, he swallowed his grief and buried his fury deep down. Once the gang was gone, he quietly recovered his dog's body. The next morning, Jim went to an old tree and buried his loyal companion with his own hands. From then on, the two didn't dare stay at any more motels. They made do with campfires on desolate roadsides, roughing it through the nights. Jim pulled out the bag of money and tried to give it back to Miguel, but the boy refused. He knew the money had originally been stolen from the gang by his uncle and hidden in his home, and that this disaster was what had gotten his mother killed. Jim understood then that this was dirty money, tainted with the blood of countless people who had crossed paths with the gang. Without another thought, he tossed the whole bag into the fire and let the flames turn every last bill to ash. Early the next morning, Jim and Miguel hit the road again, but they hadn't gone far before a lookout the gang had posted along the route spotted them. Before long, the gang's vehicles caught up to them at an intersection. Seeing them close in, Jim slammed on the brakes, whipped the car around, and floored it in the opposite direction. The gang stayed hot on their tail, and then Jim's car broke down again. There was no way to keep running, so he parked right in the middle of the road, grabbed his weapon, and got ready for a fight. As the gang's vehicle came barreling toward him, Jim fired first. A single shot took out the driver, and the car swerved out of control. He followed up with another shot, blowing out the right tire. The vehicle rolled several times before finally coming to a hard stop by the roadside. The car was totaled, but the three gang members inside somehow survived. They scrambled out and opened fire on Jim's position, forcing him to fall back. Then they pulled John out of the wreckage. Jim took Miguel and holed up in a barn on a nearby farm. He set up his rifle quickly and watched the outside. As the three closed in, Jim held his breath and drew a bead on one of them. A moment later, his shot rang out and the man dropped. The remaining two dove for cover and unloaded on the barn windows. Bullets tore through the air, and Jim hit the ground to avoid the barrage. Then, during a lull, he slipped out of the barn and circled around the other side. The two gunmen, thinking he was still inside, kept hammering the barn. Jim seized his chance. From the shadows, he fired and took out another man. Now only John was left. He carefully made his way into the barn. Miguel, sensing the danger, quickly hid in a pile of hay, trying to stay out of John's line of sight. But as he shifted position, he accidentally fell from a height and gave himself away. By the time Jim got back to the barn, Miguel was already in John's hands. To save the boy, Jim had no choice but to lower his weapon. Sensing he had the upper hand, John grabbed Miguel's hand and forced him to pull the trigger and end Jim's life himself. But at the critical moment, Miguel secretly pressed the magazine release. As John scrambled to pick up the magazine and reload, Jim charged in and tackled him hard. The two fell into a brutal hand-to-hand fight. Jim gritted his teeth through the blows and managed to slam John to the ground. He tried to subdue him with a chain, but John pulled a knife and stabbed him repeatedly, driving him into a corner. With his last ounce of strength, Jim rolled free and yanked the gun from Miguel's hands. A single shot rang out, and John finally went down. The man who had hunted Jim across the country never imagined this would be his ending, killed by the very man he'd chased. Just as Jim was about to finish it, John pulled something from his pocket. It was a military medal Jim had earned during his service years ago. As it turned out, when John had burned down Jim's house, he'd spared only this one medal and had kept it with him ever since. Because as a boy, he'd once dreamed of becoming a real soldier. If he could have chosen a different life, maybe he never would have gone down the path of the gang. After hearing this, Jim let his killing instinct go. He gently set the gun, now with just one bullet left, on the ground, giving John a final measure of dignity. Not long after Jim walked out of the barn, a single gunshot rang out behind him, and the whole feud came to an end. Jim saw Miguel all the way to Chicago and gave him that precious military medal. Watching Miguel reunite with his family and finally have a happy life of his own, Jim didn't linger. He quietly turned and walked away. He boarded a bus alone and took a seat by the window. Looking down at the wounds all over his body, the exhaustion hit him all at once. And there, in the soft sunlight pouring through the bus, Jim slowly closed his eyes. In this rescue film, Liam Neeson isn't the legendary tough guy who single-handedly takes down entire gangs. He's just a weathered old man down on his luck. But even so, he shows us that when it comes to saving someone, firepower and physical strength are only tools. What really carries you through is the courage, the kindness, and the willingness to save others that lives deep inside you.